April 23rd, 1944. The small village of Belmont, nestled in the rolling countryside of northern France, lay shrouded in early morning mist. At the village hospital, little more than a converted schoolhouse with a red cross painted on its roof, Nurse Margaret Wilson checked supplies in the dim light, certain that the upcoming day would bring nothing but the usual routine of treating local ailments. She believed her greatest challenge would be managing dwindling medical supplies until the next Allied delivery arrived. How terribly wrong she would be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true account of how one woman's act of compassion during World War II would challenge everything both sides believed about their enemies, transforming not just individual lives, but reshaping the fate of an entire community caught in the crossfire of history. The converted schoolhouse that served as Belmont's hospital had been operating since the Allied liberation of the village 6 months prior. The 29-year-old Margaret Wilson, a nurse from Boston, Massachusetts, had volunteered with the American Red Cross after reading about the desperate need for medical personnel in the European theater. With chestnut hair typically pulled back in a practical bun and steady hands that rarely trembled even during the worst procedures, she had quickly earned the respect of the medical team and the villagers alike. "Supply inventory complete, Dr. Evans," Margaret announced, placing a clipboard on the desk of the hospital's chief physician, Dr. William Evans, a 54-year-old former surgeon from Philadelphia who had seen the horrors of the First World War and had vowed to help prevent similar suffering in this conflict. "And the results?" he asked, not looking up from the patient chart he was reviewing. "Bandages sufficient for 2 weeks, morphine critically low, perhaps 3 days at current usage, penicillin." She hesitated, completely exhausted. Dr. Evans removed his wire-rimmed spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "The supply truck from Rams is scheduled for Saturday. We'll have to prioritize cases until then." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching, unusual for this early hour. Through the window, they watched as a United States Army Jeep skidded to a halt in front of the hospital. A young lieutenant jumped out, his uniform still crisp despite the early hour. "Lieutenant James Cooper, 3rd Infantry Division," he introduced himself as he entered. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge." Dr. Evans stood. "That would be me, William Evans, Chief Medical Officer for this facility." "Dr. Evans, we captured a German soldier during a night patrol. He's wounded, not critically, but our field medic recommends proper treatment." Margaret noticed the lieutenant's choice of words, captured rather than detained or took into custody. The clinical military terminology masked the human reality of what had occurred. "Lieutenant, we're critically short on supplies," Dr. Evans began. "Doctor, I understand your situation, but regulations require proper treatment of all prisoners according to the Geneva Convention," the lieutenant countered. Margaret watched as Dr. Evans considered the request. The hospital already struggled to care for the local villagers and occasionally injured Allied soldiers. Adding an enemy combatant to their responsibility would strain their resources further. "Very well," Dr. Evans finally conceded. "Bring him in. Nurse Wilson will assess his condition." Lieutenant Cooper nodded and returned to the jeep. 2 military policemen escorted a young man in a mud-stained grey uniform into the hospital. The prisoner walked with difficulty, clearly favoring his right leg. Despite his disheveled appearance, Margaret was struck by his youth. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes that darted nervously around the hospital. "Place him in examination room 3, Margaret instructed, maintaining a professional demeanor despite her internal conflict. This was the first time she would be treating someone from the opposing forces, someone who, in different circumstances, might be firing at Allied troops. The military policeman guided the prisoner to the small room at the end of the hallway. One remained posted outside while the other accompanied Margaret inside. "I'll need to examine him," Margaret said to the guard. "Some privacy would be appropriate." "Ma'am, regulations require that prisoners remain under guard at all times," the military policeman, Corporal Anderson, according to his name tag, responded. "Then you can stand by the door with your back turned," she insisted. "Medical examination requires dignity." The corporal hesitated before nodding reluctantly and taking position by the door. Facing away from the examination table, Margaret turned to the prisoner. "Do you speak English?" she asked slowly. The young man nodded tentatively. "A little," he replied with a heavy accent. "I'm Nurse Wilson. I need to examine your injury. Can you tell me your name?" He hesitated, then answered, "Müller, Friedrich Müller, Private 2nd Company, 16th Infantry Regiment." He recited his military information mechanically, as if it had been drilled into him. "Private Müller, I'm going to look at your leg now. Please roll up your pant leg or remove your trousers if needed." Private Müller understood enough to comply, carefully rolling up the blood-stained fabric to reveal a deep laceration along his calf, approximately 15 centimeters long. The wound had been hastily bandaged, but blood had seeped through. As Margaret began cleaning the wound, she noticed the young man wincing but remaining stoically silent. "How did this happen?" she asked, partly out of medical necessity and partly from human curiosity. Müller seemed to search for the right English words. "I was separated from unit, in forest. American patrol found me. I ran, fell down ravine." Margaret nodded, understanding that the wound was likely from the fall rather than a direct combat injury. As she worked, she noticed a small photograph that had fallen from the soldier's pocket. Before he could reach for it, she picked it up. It showed a middle-aged couple standing in front of a small house, presumably his parents. "Your family?" she asked, handing the photograph back. Müller nodded, taking the picture with careful hands that trembled slightly. "In Darmstadt," he said. "My father is carpenter. Mother teaches music." His English was simple, but better than he had initially let on. Margaret continued cleaning and examining the wound. "This will need stitches," she informed him, "and there's risk of infection." "When did this happen?" "Last night, maybe 11 o'clock. Nearly 12 hours ago, too long for an untreated open wound." Margaret's medical training immediately raised concerns about infection, especially given the muddy conditions where the injury occurred. "I need to check your temperature," she said, placing a thermometer in his mouth. When she retrieved it, the reading confirmed her suspicion: 38.9 degrees Celsius, the beginning of an infection. In that moment, Margaret faced her first ethical dilemma. The proper treatment would require penicillin, which they had exhausted, and was being reserved for Allied personnel and local civilians. According to military protocol, an enemy combatant would receive basic treatment, but not priority medication. "Wait here," she instructed, though the instruction was unnecessary with the guard present. Margaret found Dr. Evans in his office. "The prisoner has a deep laceration on his right calf with signs of infection setting in. He needs antibiotics." Dr. Evans looked up from his paperwork. "Nurse Wilson, you know our situation. Clean the wound, stitch it, and give him standard care. We can't spare penicillin." "But doctor, without antibiotics, he could develop sepsis. The wound was sustained in muddy conditions and has been untreated for 12 hours. "Those are the guidelines for prisoner treatment, nurse. Basic care only." Margaret felt a protest forming in her throat, but swallowed it. "Yes." "Doctor?" she replied and returned to the examination room. As she prepared to stitch the wound, Margaret engaged in conversation with Private Müller, partly to distract him from the procedure, and partly because she was genuinely curious about the young man who represented the enemy. "How old are you, Private Müller?" she asked as she threaded the surgical needle. 20, he replied, then corrected himself. "No, 21 now, birthday was last month." "And how long have you been in the military?" 2 years, was student before." "What did you study?" "Engineering," he answered, wincing as she began the first stitch. "Wanted to build bridges." Margaret worked methodically, each stitch precise and careful. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she continued, "but try to stay still." Müller nodded, his face pale but determined. As she worked, she noticed a small book in his pocket, a well-worn copy of Goethe's poems. "You like poetry?" she asked, nodding toward the book. A small smile crossed his face for the first time. "Yes, reminds me of home, of normal life." Throughout the procedure, Margaret became increasingly aware of Friedrich Müller as a person rather than an abstract enemy. He was someone's son, a student, a reader of poetry, with dreams of building bridges. The realization intensified her medical concern. Without proper antibiotics, his infection could worsen significantly. After completing 23 stitches, she bandaged the wound and helped him roll his pant leg back down. "The stitches need to stay in for at least 10 days, she instructed. "Keep the wound clean and dry." But she knew these instructions were futile. As a prisoner, he would have little control over his medical care once he left the hospital. When the guard wasn't looking, Margaret quickly checked Müller's other vital signs. His pulse was elevated, and his skin felt hot to the touch, further evidence of the infection taking hold. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Cooper returned to transport the prisoner to a collection point from where he would be sent to a prisoner of war camp. "Is he fit for transport?" the lieutenant asked Dr. Evans. "Nurse Wilson has treated his wound. He's stable for transport," Dr. Evans confirmed. As the military policeman prepared to escort Private Müller from the hospital, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't allow the young man to leave without proper treatment, not when she had the ability to help. During her lunch break, Margaret had visited her private quarters adjacent to the hospital, a small room that had once been a teacher's office. There, in her personal medical kit, was a vial of penicillin she had been saving for emergencies. It was against regulations to maintain personal medical supplies, but many nurses did so out of practical necessity. As Private Müller was being led toward the door, Margaret approached. "One moment," she said to the guards. "I need to give him final wound care instructions." The guards stepped aside, allowing her to speak with the prisoner. Under the pretense of checking his bandage one last time, she slipped the penicillin vial and a clean syringe into his pocket. "Take this every 6 hours," she whispered, knowing he might understand enough to follow the instructions. 4 doses. Müller's eyes widened slightly in understanding and gratitude, but he maintained a neutral expression. The exchange took only seconds, but it was long enough for Dr. Evans to notice something unusual in the interaction from across the room. After the prisoner had been taken away, Dr. Evans called Margaret into his office. "What did you give the prisoner, Nurse Wilson?" Margaret hesitated, her heart racing. "Instructions for wound care, Doctor." "Don't lie to me, Margaret. I've worked with you long enough to recognize when you're hiding something." Under his stern gaze, Margaret's resolve faltered. "Penicillin from my personal kit." Dr. Evans' expression hardened. "You gave critical medical supplies to an enemy combatant, supplies that could save Allied lives." "I gave medical treatment to a patient who needed it," Margaret countered, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's developing a serious infection that could lead to sepsis or worse. That's not your decision to make. There are protocols for prisoner treatment. The protocols would let him develop a life-threatening infection from a non-combat injury," Margaret argued. "That violates everything I pledged as a nurse." Dr. Evans stood up, his expression grave. "Nurse Wilson, you've put me in an impossible position. You've violated military medical protocols and potentially committed an act that could be construed as aiding the enemy." The severity of her actions suddenly became clear to Margaret. She had acted on medical ethics and human compassion, but in the context of war, her choice carried serious consequences. "I'll have to report this to military authorities," Dr. Evans continued. "In the meantime, you're suspended from duties." "Dr. Evans, please, this isn't open for discussion, Nurse Wilson. You're dismissed until further notice." Margaret left the office, her mind racing. She didn't regret helping Private Müller, but the potential consequences were only now becoming fully apparent. She could face court-martial, dishonorable discharge from the Red Cross, or worse. That evening, alone in her quarters, Margaret wrote in her journal, trying to make sense of her actions. April 23, 1944. "Today I violated orders to help a German prisoner. A boy, really. 21 years old with a family waiting for him in Darmstadt. He reads Goethe and wanted to build bridges before the war. I don't know if what I did was right by military standards, but I know it was right by human standards. Whatever comes tomorrow, I'll face it knowing I couldn't have done otherwise and remained true to my oath as a nurse." The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of commotion outside. Looking through her window, she saw Dr. Evans engaged in animated conversation with Lieutenant Cooper in front of the hospital. Her stomach tightened. Had they discovered that Private Müller had been given penicillin? Was Lieutenant Cooper here to arrest her? Margaret quickly dressed and made her way to the hospital entrance, determined to face whatever consequences awaited her. As she approached, both men turned to look at her. "Nurse Wilson," Lieutenant Cooper acknowledged her with a nod. "We need to speak with you." "I understand," Margaret replied, her voice remarkably steady despite her internal turmoil. "I take full responsibility for my actions yesterday." Lieutenant Cooper looked confused. "Actions? What are you talking about?" Before Margaret could explain, a vehicle approached in the distance. Not a military jeep, but a larger transport truck. It was moving slowly along the rural road leading to Belmont. "Is that them?" Dr. Evans asked, shielding his eyes against the morning sun. "Looks like it," Lieutenant Cooper confirmed. "Right on schedule." "Who?" Margaret asked, thoroughly confused now. Lieutenant Cooper turned to her. "The German prisoner you treated yesterday, Private Müller. He escaped during transport." Margaret felt her blood run cold. Had she inadvertently helped a prisoner escape? That would be far worse than merely providing unauthorized medication. "I didn't," she began, but Lieutenant Cooper continued. "He was recaptured within 3 hours, trying to make his way back to German lines. When questioned, he said he had to reach his commanding officer with urgent information." Margaret's confusion deepened. "What information?" "That's what we'd like to know," Dr. Evans interjected. "Because this morning a German officer approached our forward checkpoint under a white flag, requesting to speak with the medical personnel at Belmont, specifically the nurse who treated Private Müller." The approaching truck was now close enough for Margaret to see that it was a military vehicle, with armed escorts front and back. Whatever was happening, it involved high-level military attention. "Am I under arrest?" Margaret asked directly. "No," Lieutenant Cooper replied, "though your actions regarding medical supplies will need to be addressed later. Right now, we have a more pressing situation." The truck pulled to a stop in front of the hospital. The back flap opened, and several American soldiers jumped out, followed by a German officer in a crisp uniform. Despite being in enemy custody, he carried himself with dignity and authority. "Hauptmann Werner Richter, Medical Corps, 16th Infantry Regiment," Lieutenant Cooper introduced the German officer. "Captain Richter has requested to meet with you under temporary truce conditions, approved by Regional Command due to unusual circumstances." Captain Richter, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and a serious expression, approached Margaret. "Nurse Wilson?" he asked in accented but fluent English. "Yes," Margaret confirmed, still utterly confused by the situation. "Private Müller informed me of your intervention yesterday," Captain Richter stated, "without which he would likely have developed severe septicemia. I wish to express my personal gratitude." Margaret blinked in surprise. "You came under white flag just to thank me?" "Not only that," Captain Richter replied. He turned and gave a signal toward the truck. 2 German medical orderlies carefully descended from the vehicle, carrying a stretcher between them. On it lay a young woman in civilian clothes, pale and clearly unwell. "This is Elise Laurent, 19 years old, from the village of Montvert, 5 kilometers from your German-occupied lines," Captain Richter explained. "She has acute appendicitis, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Our field hospital is overwhelmed with combat casualties, and we lack the resources to treat civilians properly." Margaret looked from the girl to the German officer in astonishment. "You brought her across the front for treatment." "Private Müller convinced me that there might be medical personnel on this side willing to look beyond uniform or nationality to help someone in need," Captain Richter replied, his eyes holding Margaret steadily. "Was he correct?" Dr. Evans stepped forward. "We'll treat her, of course. Appendicitis can be fatal if not addressed promptly." As the American soldiers helped transfer the stretcher into the hospital, Lieutenant Cooper pulled Margaret and Dr. Evans aside. "This is unprecedented," he said in a low voice. "A German medical officer crossing the lines with a civilian patient. These are unusual circumstances," Dr. Evans acknowledged. "But medical ethics transcend battle lines." "There's more," Lieutenant Cooper continued. "Captain Richter has indicated there are additional civilians in need of medical attention in German-controlled villages. He's proposing a temporary medical exchange zone, a neutral area where civilians from both sides can receive treatment." Margaret looked back at Captain Richter, who was speaking quietly with the young woman on the stretcher, reassuring her. Despite his enemy uniform, in that moment, he was simply a doctor concerned for his patient. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Regional Command is considering the proposal," Lieutenant Cooper replied. "In the meantime, we treat the girl and maintain the temporary truce. And as for you, Nurse Wilson," he gave her a meaningful look, "your disciplinary hearing has been postponed indefinitely." As Margaret prepared for the appendectomy procedure, she couldn't help but marvel at how her single act of compassion toward Private Müller had set in motion events that could potentially save many more lives on both sides of the conflict. Dr. Evans approached as she was scrubbing in. "Your actions were against protocol," he said quietly. "But they may have opened a door we didn't know existed." "I just treated a patient who needed help," Margaret replied simply. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Dr. Evans acknowledged with a slight nod. "Now let's save this young woman's life." The appendectomy proceeded smoothly, with Captain Richter observing the procedure. His medical expertise became evident as he made several helpful suggestions during the operation, demonstrating that medical knowledge was universal, regardless of nationality or uniform. Following the successful surgery, Captain Richter requested a private conversation with Margaret and Dr. Evans, supervised by Lieutenant Cooper. "The situation at our field hospital is dire," Captain Richter explained. "Not only are we overwhelmed with military casualties, but we have civilians from nearby villages suffering from various conditions, from acute infections to complications of chronic diseases that have gone untreated due to the war." "We're hardly better equipped," Dr. Evans pointed out. "We're critically short on supplies ourselves." "I understand," Captain Richter nodded. "But perhaps there is a way we can combine our limited resources for humanitarian purposes." "What are you suggesting?" Lieutenant Cooper asked cautiously. "A small neutral zone, perhaps in the abandoned church at Saint-Michel, halfway between our lines. A place where civilian medical cases from both sides can be treated without fear. Medical personnel only, no weapons, supervised by both sides." Lieutenant Cooper frowned. "That would require approval from High Command on both sides. The logistics alone—" "We have already received preliminary approval from our regional commander," Captain Richter interrupted. "General Hoffman has a niece who died of appendicitis 2 years ago. When he heard about this case and Private Müller's report of Nurse Wilson's compassion, he was receptive to the possibility." Margaret listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Her impulsive decision to help one wounded soldier had somehow escalated to discussions of a neutral medical zone, an island of humanity in the sea of conflict. "Private Müller must have been quite persuasive," Margaret observed. A rare smile crossed Captain Richter's face. "He was. He described you as an angel who saw only a patient, not an enemy. His poetic nature sometimes has its uses." The conversation was interrupted by a nurse assistant announcing that Elise Laurent was awake and recovering well from the surgery. Captain Richter requested to see her, and Lieutenant Cooper escorted him to the recovery area. Left alone with Dr. Evans, Margaret finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Am I still suspended?" Dr. Evans sighed. "Technically, yes, but given the current circumstances, I'd say we need all hands available. Consider yourself temporarily reinstated pending review." "Thank you, Doctor." "Don't thank me yet," he warned. "This situation could either become a remarkable breakthrough in humanitarian cooperation, or it could collapse under the weight of military suspicion, and your original violation of protocol still stands." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of activity. Lieutenant Cooper communicated with his superiors about Captain Richter's proposal, while Margaret attended to Elise and the hospital's other patients. Captain Richter remained under guard, but was treated with the respect due to a medical officer operating under truce conditions. That evening, Margaret took a moment to visit Elise, who was recovering well from her surgery. The young Frenchwoman spoke little English, but enough to express her gratitude. "The German doctor, he saved me," Elise said in halting English. "When pain started, no French doctors in village, all gone, he find me, bring me here." "Rest now," Margaret advised, adjusting Elise's blankets. "You need to recover your strength." As Margaret turned to leave, she found Captain Richter standing in the doorway accompanied by his American guard. "May I speak with you, Nurse Wilson?" he requested formally. With the guard's permission, they stepped into the hallway. "I've received word that my commanding officer has agreed to the neutral medical zone proposal, pending American approval," Captain Richter informed her. "But there's another matter I wish to discuss." "Yes?" "Private Miller also mentioned that you provided him with penicillin from your personal supplies. At great risk to your position." Margaret tensed. He shouldn't have said anything about that. "On the contrary," Captain Richter replied, "his honesty may have saved more lives than you know. You see, when he told me what you'd done, it confirmed something I've long believed, that our common humanity and medical ethics must sometimes transcend the artificial divisions of war." Before Margaret could respond, Lieutenant Cooper approached them. "Nurse Wilson, Dr. Evans, Captain Richter, I've just received word from command. They've provisionally approved the neutral medical zone, effective immediately, for a trial period of 1 week." The news was met with stunned silence. Then Captain Richter extended his hand to Lieutenant Cooper, who, after a moment's hesitation, shook it firmly. "There will be strict conditions, of course," Lieutenant Cooper continued. "Limited personnel, daily inspections by both sides, and immediate termination if any violations occur. But it's a start." "When do we begin?" Dr. Evans asked. "Tomorrow morning," Lieutenant Cooper replied. "A small team from each side will meet at the Saint-Michel Church to establish the zone. Captain Richter has requested that Nurse Wilson be part of our medical team." All eyes turned to Margaret. The request surprised her. She was still technically under suspension for violating protocols, yet now she was being specifically requested for a groundbreaking humanitarian initiative. "Me, why?" "Because," Captain Richter explained simply, "you have already demonstrated the exact quality needed for this endeavor to succeed, the ability to see the patient before the uniform." Dr. Evans nodded slowly. "I concur with the captain's request. Nurse Wilson should be part of the team." Lieutenant Cooper looked at Margaret. "The decision is yours, nurse. This won't be without risk, and given your recent actions, no one would blame you for declining." Margaret thought of Private Müller with his book of poetry and dreams of building bridges, of Elise Laurent, saved by cooperation across enemy lines, of the countless other civilians caught between armies who needed medical care. The choice was clear. "I'll go," she said firmly. "When do we leave?" "First light tomorrow," Lieutenant Cooper replied. "Get some rest, you'll need it." That night in her quarters, Margaret wrote again in her journal, "April 24th, 1944. Yesterday, I risked my career to save one life. Tomorrow, I will help establish a neutral medical zone that could save hundreds. All because I chose to see Friedrich Müller as a patient first and an enemy second. How strange that in the midst of this terrible conflict, a small act of human compassion could create ripples of hope. Whatever happens at Saint-Michel Church tomorrow, I know now that even in war, perhaps especially in war, our shared humanity matters more than the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve." As she prepared for bed, Margaret heard vehicles approaching the hospital again. Peering through her window, she was astonished to see not just one truck but a small convoy, and as the vehicles came to a stop, she realized with shock that they were German ambulances, marked clearly with red crosses, accompanied by American military escorts. Margaret hastily threw on her robe and hurried outside. Lieutenant Cooper was already there, supervising as American and German medical personnel began carefully unloading patients from the ambulances, civilians of all ages, some on stretchers, others walking with assistants. "What's happening?" Margaret asked, approaching Lieutenant Cooper. "Change of plans," he replied, looking both stressed and amazed. "High command on both sides expedited the approval. Captain Richter's unit has brought all their civilian medical cases. They couldn't wait until morning." "His entire unit came looking for me," Margaret whispered, remembering Private Müller and the chain of events her simple act of compassion had triggered. "Not just for you," Lieutenant Cooper corrected her, gesturing to the scene unfolding before them. "For this. For a moment of sanity in the madness of war." Margaret watched as German and American medical personnel worked side by side, transferring patients, exchanging medical information, and preparing treatment spaces. Among them she spotted Private Müller, his leg bandaged but moving much better, helping an elderly woman from one of the ambulances. He caught her eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent thank you that spoke volumes about the unexpected consequences of compassion. As dawn broke over Belmont, casting golden light on the improvised medical convoy, Margaret realized that sometimes the greatest victories in war had nothing to do with capturing territory or defeating enemies. Sometimes they came in the form of small bridges built between people who had been told they were enemies, but discovered they were simply human beings caught on opposite sides of a terrible conflict. The neutral medical zone would indeed be established at Saint-Michel Church as planned, but its work had already begun in the courtyard of a small village hospital, where medical personnel from both sides worked through the night to ease suffering without regard for nationality or uniform. And it had all begun because one nurse had chosen compassion over protocol, humanity over hostility, healing over harm. April 25th, 1944. The abandoned stone church of Saint-Michel stood on a low hill between the opposing front lines, its bell tower visible from both Allied and German positions. Once a place of worship, it had been deserted early in the conflict, its stained glass windows now shattered, its wooden pews removed for firewood by soldiers from both sides. Yet, as the morning mist cleared, the old church was witnessing something extraordinary, a procession of vehicles from both armies approaching under white flags, converging on neutral ground. Margaret Wilson stood in the back of a military ambulance as it bounced along the rutted country road towards Saint-Michel. Beside her sat Dr. Evans and two other nurses from the Belmont Hospital. No one spoke much during the journey, each lost in contemplation of the unprecedented mission they were undertaking. The events of the previous night still seemed dreamlike to Margaret, German and American medical personnel working side by side at the Belmont Hospital, treating civilians regardless of which side of the front line they came from. By morning, 28 patients had received urgent care, with 3 critical surgeries performed successfully by mixed teams of Allied and German doctors. "We're approaching the checkpoint," announced their driver, a corporal from the 3rd Infantry Division. Ahead, Margaret could see American soldiers manning a roadblock, carefully inspecting each vehicle before allowing it through. Beyond them, perhaps half a kilometer away, she could make out a similar German checkpoint. Between these 2 points lay no man's land, a strip of contested territory that had seen bitter fighting in recent months, now temporarily transformed into a corridor of truce. Their ambulance slowed to a stop at the American checkpoint. Lieutenant Cooper approached, clipboard in hand. "Medical personnel only beyond this point," he reminded them. "Standard supplies as agreed upon. The church and surrounding 10 meters are designated neutral ground for 7 days, pending renewal. Both sides have agreed to maintain observation from a distance. Any violations of the terms and the arrangement ends immediately." Dr. Evans nodded. "Understood, Lieutenant." Cooper handed him an armband, white with a red cross. "Everyone wears these at all times in the neutral zone." As they distributed and affixed the armbands, Margaret noticed Private Miller among a small group of German personnel approaching from the opposite direction. His leg was still bandaged, but he moved with only a slight limp now. Captain Richter walked at the head of their group, conversing with an older German officer in a more elaborate uniform. "That's General Hoffmann," Lieutenant Cooper informed them quietly. "Regional commander for the German forces in this sector. I didn't expect him to come personally." The 2 groups converged at the church entrance. General Hoffmann, a tall man in his 50s with a stern face, softened somewhat by thoughtful eyes, approached Dr. Evans and Lieutenant Cooper. "Dr. Evans," he greeted in accented but precise English, "I am General Heinrich Hoffmann. My medical officer, Captain Richter, speaks highly of your professionalism." "General," Dr. Evans acknowledged, with a respectful nod, though not a salute, maintaining his status as a medical officer rather than a combatant. General Hoffmann turned his attention to Margaret. "And you must be Nurse Wilson, the Angel of Mercy, as my men have taken to calling you." Margaret felt her face flush slightly at the unexpected moniker. "I was just doing my duty as a nurse, sir." "Sometimes duty leads us to extraordinary places," the general replied. "My niece, Greta, was 19 when appendicitis took her life 2 years ago. No medical help could reach her in time. When Captain Richter told me about your treatment of Private Müller and the subsequent events, I saw an opportunity to prevent similar tragedies. With formalities completed, both groups entered the church together. The interior was spacious but damaged. Rain had leaked through holes in the roof, and debris was scattered across the stone floor. Yet the structure itself remained sound, and the central nave provided an ideal space for a temporary medical station. We have 3 hours to establish operations before the first scheduled patient transports arrive, Captain Richter announced. Let us make the most of our time. What followed was a remarkable scene. Former enemies working together to transform the abandoned church into a functional field hospital. American and German orderlies swept the floors and removed debris. Nurses from both sides set up cots in organized rows. Doctors established triage areas and prepared surgical stations. Margaret found herself working alongside a German nurse named Helga Schmidt, a composed woman in her 30s who had been a pediatric nurse in Hamburg before the war. I never thought I would be working with American medical personnel, Helga admitted as they arranged supplies on a makeshift table. Nor I with German, Margaret replied. Yet here we are. The patients will not care which side treats them, only that their suffering is eased, Helga observed. As they worked, Margaret noticed Private Müller assisting with the installation of a water purification system brought by the German medical team. He caught her watching him and approached somewhat hesitantly. Nurse Wilson, he greeted her formally. I wanted to thank you. The medicine you gave me. It saved my leg, perhaps my life. You're welcome, Private Müller, though I understand I have you to thank for convincing your commanding officers to consider this arrangement. Müller shook his head modestly. I only told them the truth of what happened, that on both sides there are still people who see humanity before uniform. Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Richter, calling for everyone's attention. Both medical teams gathered in the center of the church, where a large map had been spread out on a table. We have identified 12 villages within our operational area, Captain Richter explained, indicating locations on the map. 7 under German control, 5 under Allied control. All have civilian populations with limited or no access to medical care due to the fighting. Our mission is to provide services to these communities on a rotating basis. Dr. Evans added, each day we will send transport to 2 villages, 1 from each side. Priority cases will be brought here for treatment. Those requiring longer-term care will be transported to appropriate facilities behind respective lines. Margaret listened intently as the logistical details were outlined. The scale of what they were attempting became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a temporary measure, but potentially a model that could be replicated elsewhere if successful. Each team will include medical personnel from both sides, Dr. Evans continued. This ensures transparency and builds trust with all communities served. By midday, the transformation of Saint-Michel Church was complete. Rows of cots lined the nave, divided by hanging sheets for privacy. A water system had been established, and battery-powered lamps provided illumination in the darker corners. The sacristy had been converted into a surgical area, with the stone altar serving as an operating table, a different kind of sacred purpose than originally intended, but sacred nonetheless in its own way. The first patients arrived shortly after noon, 3 elderly residents from a German-controlled village suffering from malnutrition and respiratory infections, followed by a young mother and infant from an Allied-controlled hamlet with complications from a recent birth. The medical teams worked seamlessly together, language barriers overcome through the universal vocabulary of medicine and the assistance of bilingual personnel like Private Müller. As Margaret checked the vitals of an elderly German woman, she realized the patient was studying her with curious eyes. Sie sind Amerikanerin? The woman asked. Are you American? Yes, Margaret replied, recognizing the question. American. The woman patted Margaret's hand with gnarled fingers. Krieg ist verrückt. Medizin ist Wahrheit. War is madness. Medicine is truth. Though Margaret didn't understand the words, she recognized the sentiment in the woman's eyes, gratitude that transcended national divisions. Throughout that first day, the neutral medical zone treated 37 civilians, children with preventable diseases, elderly with chronic conditions, pregnant women needing prenatal care, farmers with injuries from working without proper equipment. None of them cared which uniform their caretakers wore. They were simply grateful for medical attention after months or years without. As evening approached, Margaret stepped outside the church for a moment of fresh air. The spring sunset painted the countryside in hues of gold and pink, belying the destruction that had occurred in these same peaceful-looking fields. From her vantage point, she could see both the American and German observation posts watching the church from their respective distances, a reminder that this island of cooperation existed within a sea of conflict. Lieutenant Cooper approached, offering her a canteen of water. "Quite a day," he commented, gazing at the same view. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It's almost hard to believe it's real." "High Command is following this experiment closely," Cooper informed her. "If it proves sustainable, they may implement similar arrangements in other sectors." "And my disciplinary situation?" Margaret asked. To her it seemed almost trivial now compared to what had developed, but it remained unresolved. "Officially postponed," Cooper replied with a hint of a smile. "Unofficially, I'd say you've been vindicated by events. Though I wouldn't recommend making a habit of giving unauthorized medication to prisoners. Just the once was eventful enough," Margaret agreed. As night fell, a rotation system was established so that some medical personnel could rest while others maintained the facility. Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, her mind too full of the day's remarkable events. She wandered into the church garden, where stone benches provided a place for quiet contemplation. To her surprise, she found Private Miller sitting alone, his face illuminated by moonlight as he wrote in a small notebook. "More poetry?" she asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. Miller quickly stood, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg. "Letters home," he corrected. "Telling my parents about this place, though they may find it hard to believe." "May I?" Margaret gestured to the bench, and Muller nodded, making room for her to sit. For a few moments they sat in companionable silence, former enemies finding unexpected common ground. "Before the war," Muller finally said, "I never thought much about Americans. You were just characters in films or stories in newspapers, not real people." "And Germans were the same to me," Margaret admitted. "Abstract enemies, not individuals with families and dreams and poetry books." "This church," Muller gestured to the building behind them, "it has stood for 300 years. It has seen other wars come and go. Perhaps it knows something we forget too easily." "What's that?" "That enemies are created, but humanity is constant." He tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "I studied engineering to build bridges between places. Perhaps medicine builds bridges between people." Their philosophical moment was interrupted by a shout from inside the church, a patient in distress. Both leapt to their feet and hurried inside, professional instincts overriding all other considerations. The emergency involved a middle-aged farmer who had been admitted with pneumonia. His condition had suddenly deteriorated, with severe respiratory distress and cyanosis, his lips turning blue from lack of oxygen. German and American medical personnel converged on the patient, working in concert without need for discussion on who should take which role. Dr. Evans and Captain Richter consulted rapidly on treatment options, while nurses, including Margaret, established an intravenous line and prepared emergency medications. In that critical moment, no one thought about uniforms or sides, or even the war itself. There was only a human life hanging in the balance and the collective determination to save it. After 30 tense minutes, the crisis passed. The farmer's breathing stabilized, his color improved, and he slipped into a more restful sleep. As the medical team dispersed back to their other duties, Margaret caught Captain Richter watching the scene with an expression of profound satisfaction. "This," he said quietly to her, "this is medicine as it should be, not divided by artificial boundaries, but united by common purpose." The next few days established a rhythm at Saint Michel. Each morning, transport vehicles would bring new patients from different villages. Medical teams would work through the day providing treatments, then prepare patients either for return to their homes or transfer to more permanent facilities. Each evening, German and American personnel would share a simple meal together, exchanging medical knowledge, personal stories, and occasionally, when trust had grown enough, perspectives on the war itself. On the fourth day of operations, General Hoffman returned to the neutral zone, accompanied by an American colonel named James Harrison. The two senior officers toured the facility, observing the collaborative work without interfering. Later, they called together all medical personnel for an announcement. Based on the success of this initiative, Colonel Harrison stated, "High Command has authorized an extension of the neutral medical zone for an additional 30 days, with the possibility of further extensions if conditions remain favorable." A murmur of approval ran through the assembled medical staff. General Hoffman added, "Additionally, permission has been granted to establish 2 satellite treatment points in villages on either side of the front, using the same protocols developed here." The announcement was met with applause from both German and American personnel, a spontaneous expression of relief that their work would continue. That afternoon, as Margaret assisted with distributing medications, she noticed an unexpected visitor entering the church, a man in civilian clothes whom she recognized as the mayor of Belmont. "Nurse Wilson," he greeted her warmly. "The news of this place has spread throughout the region. I had to see it for myself." "It's quite remarkable," Margaret acknowledged, "though it began simply enough." "That is how most important things begin, is it not?" the mayor observed, "with simple acts that others build upon." He handed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "The villagers of Belmont asked me to bring this to you, a token of gratitude for what you have helped create here." Later, in a quiet moment, Margaret unwrapped the package to find a handmade book, its cover crafted from leather salvaged from an old school bag. Inside were letters and drawings from Belmont residents, thanks from those who had received care at the neutral zone, children's colorful depictions of the church with red crosses, poems about healing and hope. On the inside cover was a simple inscription, "To Nurse Margaret Wilson, who saw humanity where others saw only enemies, from the grateful people of Belmont, April 1944. Margaret was deeply moved by the gift, especially coming from civilians who had endured so much during the occupation and liberation of their village. It reminded her that beyond the military structures and international conflicts, there were ordinary people whose lives were being improved by what had started with her small act of compassion. As the first week of operations drew to a close, a celebration of sorts took place at Saint-Michel. Patients well enough to participate joined the medical staff in sharing food brought from villages on both sides, French bread and German sausages, American canned goods and local cheeses, all contributing to a communal meal that symbolized something greater than mere sustenance. Dr. Evans raised a cup of water in a toast. "To medicine without borders." Captain Richter added his own, "To healing that knows no enemy." The simple ceremony was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from the American lines. Lieutenant Cooper read the dispatch and immediately sought out Margaret. "Nurse Wilson," he said, his expression unreadable, "you're ordered to report to regional headquarters tomorrow morning. The disciplinary review board has convened to address your case." Despite the success of the neutral medical zone and the apparent approval of High Command for the initiative, Margaret's original violation of protocol had not been forgotten or dismissed. The realization sent a chill through her. Would she be punished despite everything that had resulted from her actions? That night, she found it impossible to sleep, her mind racing with possible outcomes. Would she be removed from the Red Cross, sent back to America in disgrace? The neutral zone would continue without her, but the thought of leaving this remarkable project was painful. At dawn, an American jeep arrived to transport Margaret to headquarters. Private Müller, on duty at the church entrance, approached as she prepared to leave. "I heard about your summons," he said, concern evident in his voice. "It seems unjust after all you have accomplished here." "Military justice has its own logic," Margaret replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Then perhaps it needs to hear from those who witnessed your act of mercy and what resulted from it," Müller suggested. He handed her the small book of Goethe's poems she had noticed during their first meeting. "For courage," he explained. "Return it when you come back." The confidence in his voice, when, not if, gave Margaret a small measure of comfort as she departed. The journey to American headquarters took 2 hours, during which Margaret rehearsed what she would say in her defense. She would not apologize for helping Private Müller. She would only explain her medical reasoning and accept whatever consequences came. The headquarters had been established in a former winery, its stone buildings providing natural protection from artillery. Margaret was escorted to a room where 3 officers sat behind a table, a major from Medical Corps, a captain from Judge Advocate's office, and a colonel she didn't recognize. "Nurse Margaret Wilson," the major began formally, "you are here to answer charges regarding unauthorized distribution of restricted medical supplies to an enemy prisoner on April 23, 1944. How do you plead?" "I acknowledge providing penicillin to the prisoner, sir," Margaret replied steadily. "You understand this constitutes a serious breach of protocol," the captain stated, shuffling through paperwork. "Medical supplies are strictly rationed, with priority given to Allied personnel and civilians in Allied territory." "I understand the protocol, sir. I also understand my oath as a nurse to provide care to those in medical need." The colonel, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Nurse Wilson, your actions, while technically a violation, have had unexpected consequences. Would you care to elaborate on the events following your treatment of Private Mueller?" Margaret described the sequence of events: Mueller's capture, his wound, her decision to provide antibiotics, his subsequent escape attempt and recapture, Captain Richter's arrival under white flag, and the establishment of the neutral medical zone at Saint-Michel. As she spoke, she noticed the colonel taking particular interest. When she finished, he introduced himself. "I'm Colonel William Marshall, Strategic Initiatives. I've just returned from observing operations at Saint-Michel Church." He turned to his colleagues. "Gentlemen, what began as a protocol violation has evolved into a humanitarian initiative with significant strategic implications." The major looked skeptical. "Strategic implications, sir?" "Indeed," Colonel Marshall confirmed. "The neutral zone has not only provided essential care to civilians on both sides, but has generated considerable goodwill among the local population. Intelligence reports indicate increased civilian cooperation with Allied forces in the region, including valuable information about German troop movements." The Judge Advocate captain interjected, "While that may be true, sir, we must consider the precedent. If we dismiss Nurse Wilson's violation, what message does that send to other medical personnel about following protocols?" "A fair point," Colonel Marshall acknowledged, "which is why I've consulted with General Bradley's staff on this matter." He withdrew an official document from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "This directive authorizes the formal establishment of neutral medical zones in appropriate sectors based on the Saint-Michel model. It also includes a provision for the discretionary use of medical supplies in exceptional circumstances, where humanitarian benefit may outweigh strict adherence to protocol." Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her spontaneous act of compassion had apparently influenced policy at the highest levels. "As for Nurse Wilson," Colonel Marshall continued, "General Bradley recommends a formal reprimand for the protocol violation, followed by immediate reassignment as liaison officer to the Saint-Michel neutral zone, with authorization to establish similar initiatives in other sectors as conditions permit." The other officers looked surprised but did not object to the general's recommendation. "It seems, Nurse Wilson," the medical major said with the hint of a smile, "that your violation has been transformed into innovation. Consider yourself officially reprimanded for the unauthorized use of medical supplies." "And unofficially commended for your humanitarian initiative," Colonel Marshall added. "You'll return to Saint-Michel tomorrow with the new directives. The experiment you helped start will become a formal program." Margaret returned to Saint-Michel the following day to find an atmosphere of anxious anticipation. Word of her disciplinary hearing had spread, and both American and German medical personnel were concerned about her fate and what it might mean for the neutral zone. As her jeep pulled up to the church, she saw Private Mueller standing with Captain Richter, Dr. Evans, and several others. Their expressions transformed from concern to relief when they saw her emerge from the vehicle with a smile. "You've returned," Captain Richter observed. "With good news, I hope." Margaret handed him the official documents. "Better than good. The neutral zone has been officially sanctioned, with authorization for expansion to other sectors." The news spread quickly through the medical facility, generating quiet celebration among staff and patients alike. What had begun as an impromptu arrangement born of compassion was now a recognized humanitarian initiative with the potential to help countless civilians caught between battle lines. That evening, Margaret sought out Private Müller to return his book of poems. "Keep it," he insisted, a reminder that even in war, humanity can prevail. "What will happen when the fighting ends?" Margaret asked, suddenly wondering about the future. "When we return to being simply Americans and Germans, not enemies?" Müller considered the question thoughtfully. "Perhaps what we've learned here will travel with us, that underneath uniform and nationality, we share the same hopes, fears, and humanity." "I'd like to believe that," Margaret said. "Then believe it," Müller replied simply, "and act on that belief, as you did when you gave medicine to an enemy soldier without seeing him as an enemy." In the months that followed, the Saint-Michel model was replicated in several sectors along the front, creating islands of cooperation amid the conflict. Margaret's role expanded from nurse to coordinator, helping establish protocols and train personnel for new neutral zones. The war would continue its terrible course, with all its horror and loss, but within these small spaces of agreed neutrality, something remarkable flowered, proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion could build unexpected bridges between divided people. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, over 5,000 civilians had received care at neutral medical zones inspired by the Saint-Michel model. The initiative was later studied by the newly formed United Nations and World Health Organization as a template for humanitarian corridors in future conflicts. Margaret Wilson returned to Boston after the war, where she established a training program for international medical cooperation that eventually sent teams to disaster and conflict zones around the world. Her original protocol violation became a case study in medical ethics, when rigid adherence to rules must yield to higher humanitarian principles. Friedrich Müller completed his engineering studies after the war and indeed fulfilled his dream of building bridges, both literal ones across Germany's rivers and figurative ones as part of international reconstruction efforts. He and Margaret maintained a correspondence for many years, exchanging letters about their work, their families, and their shared belief that medicine could heal more than just physical wounds. The Saint-Michel Church still stands today, restored after the war. A small plaque by its entrance commemorates the neutral medical zone established there in 1944, reading simply, "Here, in the midst of war, enemies became healers. May we remember that compassion knows no borders." The story of how one nurse risked her career to save a German prisoner of war, only to have his entire unit come looking for her the next day, not for vengeance but for cooperation, remains a powerful reminder that even small acts of humanity can ripple outward in unexpected ways, sometimes changing the course of history itself. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.